Well, I'm doing a few videos reflecting on my recent visit to San Francisco. The reflections are not necessarily much to do with San Francisco, but I was reminded of this book that I wrote back in 2010, it's published somewhere around 2010, 2011, called Using the Medical Model in Education. And the subtitle, which is very difficult to read on this cover, says, "Can Pills Make You Clever?" And the book is about cognitive enhancers, smart drugs, pills that make people smarter. And the title of the book was Using the Medical Model in Education. Well, I suppose my first reflection on the title is what a bad title I chose. Using the Medical Model in Education. Librarians tend to put it on a shelf about medical education, and nobody thinks it's a book on general education or bothers to read the subtitle. So it doesn't get much attention, but it was a book that was written originally. I listened to a radio programme on the BBC, and I had such a strong reaction against the programme. I wrote a book in order to explain to myself what it was I didn't like about the programme. The programme's still available on the BBC website if you want to watch it, and it's called The Defeat of Sleep. You might think that's a strange title, but it's kind of attitude. You'll have heard, of course, the nonsense that we only use 10% of our brain, and obviously if we sleep we also waste a third of our day if sleep does nothing for us at all. And this programme was about the use of drugs which would allow us to use more of our brain, to be more efficient, to avoid sleeping, in order to make better use of our brain power. And the core focus was on a drug called modafinil. Now, modafinil is a drug that's registered for controlling sleep patterns. People who use it for controlling jet lag, for people who work night shifts and have sleep pattern disorders because they work irregular hours. Modafinil can be used and is registered for use in controlling sleep patterns. And it's rumoured to be able to enhance your thinking powers. Now, bear in mind, it's not licensed for enhancing your thinking powers, so the manufacturers never have to prove that it enhances one's cognitive ability, but if students and others believe it enhances, then they'll buy it off prescription, they'll use it illegally, in the hope of improving their performance in examinations and so on. And my view is that it doesn't solve the problems of learning. If you haven't learnt the things in the first place, then you're not going to be able to recall them in an examination. However actively your mind is buzzing and fizzing, it's not going to be able to recall things that you didn't know in the first place. So my view was that the idea that there are cognitive enhancers that work irrespective of whether you've done the study, that seems to me to be simplistic, and it seemed to me right and proper to write a book explaining that if you just put your money out to buy drugs instead of doing the revision, then you're wasting your money in the first place, and you're taking steps that might be dangerous. So that was the point about the book. I was responding to the program. The program was full of people who I thought demonstrated a high level of hubris about the effectiveness of these drugs. One of the arguments that was put, you may have come across a paper by George Miller, published in 1956, called The Magic Number 7 plus or minus 2, and it's one of the most highly cited papers in social sciences ever. And he argued that people can remember 7 things. If you remember telephone numbers, you can remember 7-digit telephone numbers. Most people can remember a 7-digit telephone number without too much trouble. 9-digit telephone numbers, more difficult. And so we tend to break things down so that we can remember them in units, and you can store 7 things in your active memory. You can, if you're a musician, most musicians can distinguish 7 different tones. This number 7 kept cropping up in lots of different circumstances, and Miller did not suggest that it was an absolute limit to what we think. If you ask somebody, what do you know about France? Well, I could remember 7 things about France off the top of my head. There's a major port in the south called Marseille. The Eiffel Tower is in Paris. Paris is the capital of France. I'll run off a string of 7 things that I know about France. If you ask somebody who's French 7 things about France, they will also remember 7 things, but they'll remember 7 much more complex things. It's not just about the quantity of information we can store, it's about the chunks and how we organise them into chunks in order to make them memorable. However, that subtlety was not taken into account in The Defeat of Sleep, and there was a speaker who suggested that if you took modafinil, the experiments they'd conducted with healthy males suggested that if you took modafinil, you could remember, instead of remembering 7, you could remember 9. You could remember a couple of extra items. You could be in slightly more control over your recall and your active memory. And it was actually suggested that this might be the difference between an Einstein and an ordinary person. A genius, a Michelangelo, a Mozart, and an ordinary person might be the ability to remember 9 things rather than 7. Now, I'm deeply sceptical of that, because I had a friend at that time who was getting old, getting forgetful, as I am now, and who argued that his thinking became clearer and sharper precisely because he couldn't remember as much. He had to refine it down, cut out the frills, cut down to the bone, and become clearer. So being a brilliant thinker is not just about how much you can keep in memory at a time, but so I regarded some of the thinking about the effect that this drug had was rather naive. But the stories that struck me most forcibly were that modafinil as a drug that was could be used to control sleep, had been used by the Army, had been used by the United States Army in the first Iraq War for soldiers to maintain themselves awake. If a soldier is awake, they are able to be active on duty longer. If they don't have to sleep, you've got 2 soldiers in one body, as it were, because they don't have to take the time off to be sleeping. So they were using these drugs like modafinil to stay awake And what they discovered was that high-level cognitive function deteriorated with staying awake. If you're sleep deprived, you tend to lose high-level cognitive function, and low-level cognitive function is maintained. Wakefulness is maintained. And what does that mean? Well, it means that if you've got a gun and you've got to line up the crosshairs of a gun on a target, then you can line up fairly well on the target. But the high-level skill of judging what to point the gun at tends to deteriorate. And there were a number of incidents of friendly fire, so-called friendly fire, where soldiers had been awake and alert enough to point the gun and hit the target, but were not very good at selecting the targets. So that was a story that was, I thought, salutary tale, that there was a risk that if you sleep is actually performing a useful function for us. If you think of sleep as wasted time, then you haven't understood what's going on in terms of memory and processing memory. And if you deprive people of sleep, for whatever reasons, their judgment starts to deteriorate. Well, now, why did I come back to this book after 15 years, and what brought it to mind now? Well, I read a report, and it's widely reported in Rolling Stone, CNN, Reuters, reliable news sources, that during Trump's first period of office in the White House, drugs that were in circulation off prescription were widely being used, and one of the drugs was a drug called Provigil. And Provigil is the trademark name of modafinil. So this drug was widely available in the White House during Trump's first period of office. And I have no idea about the present day, but you can draw your own conclusions. And it looked to me as though if you have somebody who's on Provigil, they might stay up all night, they might be tweeting on, sending social media messages all night, but their judgment about what to put in those social media messages might not be quite so sharp as it should have been if they were going to be sending messages responsibly. So I go back to that program that I reacted so negatively to. Actually, there were speakers, contributors to that program, who were saying, in effect, just think if the world was run by politicians who use their brains more effectively, who could use these cognition enhancers to use their brains more effectively and to be in better mental control of their policies and their decisions, then the world would be a better place. And I look at the world today and I suspect that Provigil is playing a part in the very erratic behaviour that we see in the American administration today. And I think, be very careful what you wish for. Be careful if you wish for politicians who are managing or mismanaging their thought patterns with the help of artificial stimulants, then you may not get the result that you want. And I think we need to be very clear about this in terms of educational development. I have no faith in, if you're studying, for example, I drink coffee, I have no objection to stimulants, but I think we need a whole rounded view of what it means to learn something. And we need to take something like a rounded view from a psychologist like Vygotsky, who says that you need to internalize the thought techniques, the thought patterns, the tools, the mental furniture that you use. You need to internalize them over a period of time and make them your own before you can apply them and use them on your own. And that's a very different process from just popping a pill. Popping a pill might help in some parts of that cycle, but they're not a substitute for it. So we need to be cautious about extravagant claims that drugs can replace the hard work of thinking. And I think we see some rather similar hubris around artificial intelligence today than we saw around cognitive enhancers 15 years ago. So I think that you need to be cautious, even if everybody is telling you that AI, that cognitive enhancers are going to change the shape of education, that AI is going to put us all out of work. Be very careful and make your own decision and weigh things up carefully rather than simply accepting a view because it's widely held.